Hello, everyone. Have you ever had this experience of trying to debate a political point, for example, with someone, and you're willing to argue your case or what you believe or your opinions, and there is no room for debate with this other person. They will just say no, but I don't want to hear it, or that at best. At worst, you might even be insulted or considered evil or something. In other words, you cannot reach. You're trying to express your opinions, and you can't. You're not allowed to. This is what I'm going to deal with today, and it's based on a psychological study by the Dutch, American, and then Dutch again, psychologist Joost Meerloo. He lived in the 20th century, mid-20th century, he was writing. He was born in 1903 and died in 1976. A Dutch-American doctor of medicine and psychoanalyst. He wrote a book, a very influential book, called The Rape of the Mind, an analysis of brainwashing techniques and thought control in totalitarian states. He was writing at the time in the mid-20th century. You understand about the two major political movements in the century. You know the ones I'm referring to. And I was listening to several videos dealing with his philosophy and his books, and so I thought that I would do this one based on that. Basically, he says that the perfect war, as it were, is the one won without firing one single shot or launching one single bomb. An invisible hidden war. You must remember this, that he's writing in the middle of the 20th century, and techniques now have advanced tremendously, yes. But an invisible hidden war that doesn't require spectacular territorial invasions, because something much more effective has been achieved, and that is the silent invasion of the human mind. He published one of the more exhaustive works in the field of psychology and mind control. In his work, he explained with great precision the techniques of psychological or psychic interference and perception manipulation that totalitarians, let's say that, totalitarians, okay? The totalitarians may be open, you can see them, or they may be hidden, yeah? But totalitarians have deployed, when he was writing at the time of the world wars. These are his words. With these techniques, the aim was to take possession of both the simplest nerve patterns as well as the most complicated patterns in the human mind. It is the battle for the possession of nerve cells in the brain. It is a coercion and a force conversion of the through slogans, mainly verbal stereotypes and formulae that imprint reflexes on a human mind that had previously already been destroyed. He's going to tell us about how they would destroy the human mind and then rebuild it, as it were. The totalitarian, he continues, wants first the required response of the nerve cells, then the control of the individual, and finally the control of the masses. I'll repeat that. The totalitarian wants first the required response of the nerve cells, then the control of that individual, and finally, through this and that and the other individual, the control of the masses. Now, there's been 70 years since his work was published, and it can be successfully argued that the real totalitarian powers that today have global control continue using the same principles, as we shall see. Naturally, now they have much more advanced technologies, but the premises remain the same. First, fracture or break the minds of the population in order to condition them afterwards. So first fracture, then demolition and programming. This is the dynamic on which the global system of psychological intervention is based, by which thoughts are implanted and behaviors are programmed. You might be thinking, what? Program? No, I'm not programmed. Well, okay. At the end of let me go back. At the end of the 19th century, and this is a long time ago, the end of the 19th century already, the Russian Nobel Prize winner, Pavlov, was famous for his experiments, many of them. Ivan Pavlov's experiments are known for demonstrating classical conditioning. This is the very beginning, yeah? Which is the idea that behaviors can be learned through conditioning. Some of his most famous experiments included the famous one with the bell and the dog, yeah? Pavlov repeatedly paired the sound of a bell with food, causing the dog to eventually salivate at the sound of the bell alone, without the food. This is because the bell became a conditioned stimulus that was associated with food. He conducted these experiments over time to understand the normal function of dogs. This was different from previous experiments that had been done, which were acute in the sense of being, they had up to that time involved vivisection. Pavlov's work contributed to the development of behavioral psychology, behaviorism, the theory that all behaviors are learned through conditioning. This is what he did. Each time that Pavlov fed the dog, he rang a bell. After many, many repetitions, the stimulus of the bell generated the same response as the food itself. When the dog heard the bell, the dog would begin to salivate, or said differently, for the dog, the bell and food were almost the same thing. This theory of Pavlov's conditioned reflexes was soon applied to human beings. And to the surprise of researchers, actually, they found that our capacity to be conditioned as human beings was actually much higher than that the one that the dogs displayed. In the hands of people with totalitarian ambitions, this field of experimentation had the potential to convert large human masses of people in automata at the service of their programmers. And that is what happened. The rise of totalitarian movements in the 20th century was possible thanks to the massive implementation of these techniques of manipulation and mental control. The ideal of totalitarian psychology is to tame man, to turn men, the masses, into voluntary tools in the hands of their leaders. Like training, domestication has the aim to automatize, is that a word, automatize, automate, I don't know, become, automatize, I suppose, their actions. Unlike training to achieve, unlike other ways of training to achieve a goal. For example, you can have a training, just an ordinary training. For example, you're training to play a musical instrument, or you're training to win an Olympic swimming medal or something, and you're training, but you are conscious then of what you are doing and why you are doing it. You are conscious of it. But this is conscious training, but he was talking about unconscious training, not the conscious participation of the student. Some believe naively that the decline of totalitarian regimes as they used to be put an end to this psychology of mental control, but the truth is that it's actually the opposite. After the world wars, this field achieved its greatest degrees of perfection, if you like, and became a form of mass control and mass domination through propaganda in a different way. When they want you to believe in something, this does not mean that war conflicts have ceased to be relevant, as we see. They continue to break out everywhere, and they will continue, continuous wars, etc. They will continue to do so, but their reason for being is increasingly propagandistic. Underneath the territorial or the political or the economic disputes, underneath all that is the real battle, possession of the mind. They prepare you beforehand. You can think at examples, yes? First of all, through the media, they begin to say these people bad, these people good, and so on. You are prepared. So when conflict comes, you are already predisposed to this one side, yeah? All the psychological operations of the past, the present, and the future repeat and will always repeat two main patterns that happen at the same time or immediately one following the other. These two patterns, according to this author, Leroux, is psychic demolition or psychological demolition with a negative stimulus or with negative stimuli, and then conditioning with positive stimuli. Patterns that the two patterns, one that first destroys and then a pattern of hope that builds. At the same time that the mind is attacked and torn apart with negativity and despair sometimes, the mind is at the same time also exposed to a hypnotic kind of programming that through manipulative use of uplifting your feelings, they are going to implement new schemes in the psychic, in that psychic void where nothing has been left, that void that remains there. Let's talk about each one of them first. The demolition of the mind. You might say, my goodness, demolition is a little bit strong. Well, perhaps it is, but let's see. This demolition of the mind is achieved through the creation of psychological chaos, psychic chaos. It is about inducing a constant disorder pattern in the mental processes. Worry, fear, disorder, disasters, thus producing what Meerloo termed menticide, a word that derives from mens, mind, and caedere, to kill. His words: the core of the menticide is to take away, to remove all hope. The victim is completely alone, and the mind is put in a condition of practical slavery, certainly submission. And how is this done? There are three main ways of negative stimulation to provoke this devastating chaos. These are his points in his book. First, isolation and division. Second, confusion. Third, infantilization, the childlike. Let's look at these three principles separately. Isolation and division first. Pavlov in the 19th century discovered that the best way to develop the conditioned reflex in dogs was to isolate them. And the same happens with humans. Isolated individuals are also conditioned much more easily, actually. Does this mean that we have to be physically isolated necessarily? Well, this helps, as we saw during a certain global event in 2020, but it is not strictly necessary. In fact, there is another form of isolation, even more effective, and that is ideological divisions. The totalitarian knows that one individual ideologically possessed, he says, these are his words, ideologically possessed. Sometimes we call them now a cult mentality, something like that. But we don't need to join a cult to be there, okay? He called them ideologically possessed. This individual, ideologically possessed, I repeat, first, does not interact peacefully with those that oppose him, those who do not share their stance or their beliefs. This individual remains isolated, closed in their small ideological bubble, and this greatly facilitates the totalitarian's manipulative task, who will be able to easily control the negative stimulation, the distraction, which he will actually physically destroy. Little by little, there will be awakening feelings more and more of anger and rage and frustration and indignation, and mixing this also with small waves of euphoria and enthusiasm, similar to what a gambler experiences when playing the machines or cards in a casino. Achieving this actually is very simple for the totalitarian. He has the technological methods to distort reality and control both the times and the intensity of the confrontations. Individuals, regardless of their ideology, must see this confrontation as an end in itself, not as a means to achieve something else, not as a means to achieve consensus, but almost an existential end in itself. And in no case will be allowed that the two camps will find meeting points to dialogue or show genuine will to start common projects. Disagreements, ruptures must be total, Few things destroy the psychic apparatus as quickly and effectively as this continuous perpetual fragmentation and thirst for revenge. This is where they want you to get to. That revenge, that anger. That's the first principle. The second is confusion. This is achieved by twisting the sense of logic, he claims. When he says logic, he doesn't mean logic as a philosophical discipline necessarily. Something that is logical, common sense, your feet firmly on the ground, yeah? These are his words, because he studied the people at the time in concentration camps, and he says, many victims of totalitarianism have told me in interviews that the most disturbing experience they faced in the concentration camps was the sensation of the loss of logic, the state of confusion to which they had been taken and in which nothing made sense anymore. They had reached that Pavlovian state of inhibition, which psychiatrists called now mental disintegration or depersonalization. In other words, victims must lose their ability to approach reality logically. So you're lost, yeah? There is a semantic, the meaning of words, there is a fog there that permeates the atmosphere, and words lose their meaning, their direct communicative function. Nothing has anymore a sort of a stable and a shared meaning. Not anymore. Words, they don't mean what they are supposed to mean. Good and bad, truth and falsehood, reality and illusion, man and woman, decent and abhorrent, beautiful and grotesque, just and unjust. The meaning is twisted, that you just don't know anymore. And reality becomes so fluid and indefinite that each everyday, daily event can be turned into a source of psychological shock. Something as simple as that. His words, logic can confront logic, but illogic cannot. It confuses those who think clearly. And while one can continue to try to find a reasonable counter-argument for the first lie, that you see it is a lie or a falsehood or it is not real, and you're trying to explain it, you're trying to show it is a falsehood or an error or a mistake, while you are at it, the totalitarian will attack it with another one. So by the time you're done, you have another one and then another one. At the end, the individual can no longer believe in anything and retreats into a sort of a sullen and often a nihilistic defense. His psychic references are destroyed, and he becomes then susceptible to believing in anything. That's the second principle. The third is infantilization. The individual is taken to a state of perpetual immaturity and dependence. Like Peter Pan, this childlike mentality makes him feel overwhelmed by reality, by the pain and the suffering and the uncertainty that life entails. And so he seeks a way to escape from it by withdrawing into the self. It is, he referred to it as the puer eternus, the eternal child. Mentally locks himself into the me, I, the self. And the body that necessarily must cooperate with the mind in this search for evasion becomes then addicted to sensual pleasure. Bodily enjoyment becomes his personal me, where everything is comfortable and predictable. Mental escapism cannot be sustained only with imaginations about what the world should be and is not. To maintain this fantasy, body and mind join the compulsive search for carnal pleasures, until desires are placed at the center of his identity. I am what I desire, and beyond that there is nothing, or at least nothing worthwhile. So carnal joy and concupiscence, I'm Catholic, yeah, absorb all his attention, as if they were sort of tyrant gods who demand fanatical worship. And this extreme supremacy of the me and the I and the self, in addition to destroying people's psychic, also tears away at the social fabric, obviously. Those so-called intermediate identities that exist between the individual and the state, for example, marriage, the family, the community, the neighborhood, all those little by little disappear, as we see everywhere today, because the individualist mentality considers that these subsidiary other identities are irrelevant, since they do not serve him in his search for hedonistic pleasure and satisfaction of his desires. Besides, a deified me as a god, me, cannot bear the idea of another identity to be above himself. So he discards them and offers them, so to speak, in sacrifice to his false gods of desire, and thereby does away with anything that actually existed before to protect him from the Leviathan, from Big Brother. There they were to protect him, and he ends up discarding them. An individual without family, without community, without ties, is left completely defenseless before this crushing power of the tyrant. Now let's look at the other way. Okay, so the mind is destroyed, and now they're going to feed you hope, a different ideology or a different way of viewing things, and that is called mental conditioning. So if the demolition of the mind focuses in creating chaos and disorder, this other, the process of conditioning, tries to achieve precisely the opposite, the promise of an order that awakens feelings of hope and longing. The totalitarian broke the mind with disorder, but also presents you with a perfect solution, more or less perfect, to all those conflicts which they themselves, the totalitarians, created to begin with. An agenda with which all of us together we will all build a perfect state, able to satisfy all of our material needs and do away with all the dangers that threaten us today. And that agenda is the new sort of gospel that leads us all to that promised land, the state paradise. In the demolition of the mind, in that process, they in that process they stole away your hope. The conditioning once again offers you hope, brings it back, changed, and so creating the mental and emotional ups and downs ideal for the control of the masses and the manipulation of the masses. They take it away, they give you a different one, all these mental and emotional ups and downs. This process of mind conditioning is mainly a dialectical process. So what does that mean? Okay, the promise of a better world, or something they will offer you to do away with all this chaos and disorder. That promise of a better world, not yet having a concrete material reality, must be supported by language. Through simplifications, excessive simplifications, repeated and repeated ad nauseum. The totalitarian is implanting certain psychic patterns and molding the minds until the individual is tied up with their, buys into their miraculous agenda, as if it were a spell. He says, his words, in order to mechanically repeat its suppositions and suggestions. That is the simple formula. To mechanically repeat its suppositions and suggestions. That is the simple formula for the political conditioning of the masses. The pre-prepared opinions reach the nerve cells and implant there a fixed pattern of thought in the brain. Continuous repetition. The continual suggestion and the slow hypnosis of massive mechanical communication will promote the uniformity of mind, the uniformity of the mind in the masses. Man no longer thinks of personal values. He no longer has considerations about that which his moral intuition is telling him. He thinks more and more of that which the communication media transmits and broadcasts, and little by little converts him into he himself being the pinnacle of his own moral scale. He thinks it's him, but he has been put there. His self is gone. However, slogans are not enough by themselves, on their own. We human beings, we need to see how those, or we have a need to see how those ideological and linguistic abstractions become something tangible. We have a need to see leaders who know how to embody them. And this is why those engineers of public opinion serve as what Meerloo calls hypnotists. He calls the media hypnotists, or the engineers of public opinion. He says prodigious figures who easily dazzle the masses and become an example to follow for many people. In politics, for example, the hypnotists are usually pseudo-messianic figures that appear at the perfect moment. They will solve your problems if you follow them, at the point of maximum social tension, in order to put an end to all this chaos and desperation created by the totalitarian in the first place. By offering a simple, quick, and apparent infallible solution. Those hypnotists immediately gain the trust of the people who place their hopes in them. And so, having been bathed and blinded with their warm glow and radiance, the masses cannot see his or their political intentions. A few examples. Remember that he's writing this in the mid-20th century. Yeah. So I'm not pointing, by quoting these examples, I'm not pointing to any one current politician specifically. Your mind will go to several, I'm sure. He says, for example, in a country where chaos is generated by absolutely unsustainable levels of crime, the hypnotist eliminates this all with practically the wave of a hand, drastic but highly effective measures. That is his promise. They have a very good way of reading the people. Yeah. In another country where chaos is generated by radical ideologies whose excesses sink the economy, for example, the hypnotist appears with his chainsaw to cut short all those client networks that were bleeding the people dry, and promises to establish a paradise of perpetual freedom that will arrive in due time if we are a little patient and servile. In a country where chaos is generated by absolutely uncontrolled illegal immigration, for example, the hypnotist promotes the idea that as soon as he comes to power, he will build a sort of a higher wall than those of Babylon itself. In a country where chaos is generated by corrupt institutions that have been draining a people mired in misery for decades, the hypnotist comes to undo once and for all the old corruption pacts and installs a new spring. The political hypnotist must ultimately align himself with the most popular aspirations, the aspirations of the masses, and has to give them something that immediately solves that which they can no longer stand, they can no longer bear it, that situation, or at least something that seems to solve it. Obviously, the solutions of these hypnotists are not going to satisfy everybody, but because there will always be other ideological groups of people who will be outraged at these measures. No problem. And here is where you have to be very cautious, because they too, the dissenters, will have their own false pseudo-messiahs. Sometimes it is called control opposition. We call it nowadays. Yeah. All areas of the ideological spectrum will have their own hypnotists. Whenever there are people fed up with the excesses of the right, there will be a pseudo-messiah of the right. And where people are fed up with the excesses of the left, there will appear a pseudo-messiah from the left. And if you're totally fed up with the globalist agenda, don't worry, there will appear a pseudo-messiah, against globalism. The thing is, for us to know who is true and who is a hypnotist, that's not always that easy. So you see, what happens is the alternation of power in governments, the different political parties, is not really a problem for the totalitarian, the one who, the puppeteer, not the puppets, since the same agenda will advance unstoppably. in all cases. Coming from the left or from the right, or from the top or from the bottom, the hypnotists will know what they must do to establish the totalitarian agenda. But you see, not only in politics, not only there are political hypnotists in politics. We have the so-called celebrities too, so-called cultural hypnotists. They're called cultural for some reason. I don't know exactly. Well, but anyway, yeah. Cultural. They establish perhaps public opinion. Yeah. The celebrities. They are also essential. Not perhaps to you, certainly not to me, not obviously everybody, but a heck of a lot of people are influenced by them, especially the young. Why? Because they embody something that the masses long to see materialized. And it is thanks to these figures that certain points of the agenda are legitimized before large crowds. There are hypnotists for women disenchanted with their amorous relationships. There are hypnotists for men fed up with the excesses of certain ideologies. There are hypnotists for those who suffer from climate ecological anxiety. There are hypnotists for those who dream of a futuristic world, an interstellar sort of humanity that can no longer be touched by disease and lives forever. Each one enchants the masses because he promises to bring renewal, and those who worship them are blinded by their radiance, and so are able to suggest to their mental servants, as it were, several suggestions, so that they accept certain things that they would not have embraced otherwise. And so they go on to justify the unjustifiable. In the words of Meerloo, quote, "The group can be hypnotized on a daily basis with noise, with the press, radio, and television, with fears and pseudo-enthusiasms. Any deception can be easily instilled. Carefully implanted delusions are difficult to correct. Reasoning no longer has value because the type of inferior, more animal-like thinking becomes deaf to any other thought at a higher level. If we want to resist the overwhelming push of the totalitarian, Meerloo maintains that the first step is to become familiar with these dynamics that are being used against us. If we are not able to recognize how we ourselves, however independent we think we might be, if we are not able to recognize how we ourselves might be promoting division or spreading confusion or falling into infantilization that we are capable of, and supporting such individualism, and how we are allowing ourselves, we have to become aware of this, that we might be allowing ourselves to become seduced by false and pseudo-messiahs who will be at the service of those dark powers that want to rip out our soul, while we tell ourselves the fable that we are dissidents of the system, we might not be as much as we think. He says, training against brainwashing must be carried out in an exhaustive way. We can build internal defenses against thought control and against the daily barrage of suggestions continually, yeah? With the help of good and repeated training, people can become familiar with the concepts, then become familiar with the concepts and the words and so on. Then the perceptive defense, once you do that, then the perceptive defenses develop, he says, and we learn to detect false propaganda and not to listen to it. He continues, I quote, "A man with a profound knowledge of himself, aware of his own internal conflicts, and also aware of what the enemy is trying to do to him, is prepared to face and resist the attack." He continues, "I questioned many people in my research who suffered the tortures of prisons and concentration camps, those who understood themselves, who were willing to accept the dangers and the challenges ahead, and who realized, even if vaguely, how beastly or bestial a man can be. Those people were best able to endure the harrowing experience of the camp. They were not defeated by their own naive perplexity and their lack of hope, their lack of knowledge of themselves and others, but rather they were not defeated because they were protected by their knowledge of themselves and, he says, inquisitive vigilance. But there are also other factors that play an important role. He says, "My research has made it amply clear to me that those who are able to resist, who can maintain their strength in marginal circumstances, they never feel that they are alone. There is always in them, or there was always in them, a knowledge of loving others or caring for others, or certainly being very much aware of the other, beyond themselves, that's the thing, beyond themselves, and to be loved and cared in return. And this knowledge," he says, "is not limited to just love of family or friends. You might be in a situation where you have no family and you have no friends. You are in a situation where everyone has gone away, or you are in a concentration camp. You have nobody around you. But," he says, and this is what I found fascinating, "what I have found is that those people also in whom a religious faith is alive and deeply rooted also have the same sense of belonging, of willing to help others, and of being needed and of being loved." In other words, he found through research that actually if you have a living faith in God, actually, that will actually help you. Isn't that amazing? Because nowadays in this world we see that, being atheist or agnostic is cool. I don't believe in anything, Actually, even if you don't do it from a religious perspective, just thinking of your mind, of your mental strength, actually believing in a God and a creator and you in that creation might actually help you. And I was thinking about that. And I thought this is very, very interesting. And so I went to, since this psychoanalyst is talking about, mainly he studied the prisoners in concentration camps and so on. The thought came to me about a saint in the Catholic Church. We consider him a saint, Maximilian Maria Kolbe. 20th century. He died in Auschwitz. He, if I can tell you one or two things about him, he was Polish, and he had been accused of subversion for having hidden many Jews where he was in his monastery. What happened was that there was an attempted, he was, at the end, he was imprisoned, and he was in a concentration camp himself. And what happened was that there was an attempted escape from the concentration camp. And there was one man there, personally leader of the Jewish resistance, whom they chose, among others, to go and to kill them. Yeah. And this particular individual started crying, understandably. He was talking to him, to Maximilian, about his family and his sons and what was going to happen. Anyway, he was crying, and so in profound sadness and despair. And so Kolbe talked to the guards and actually offered himself in the place of this man. Take me, leave him here, and you take me instead. And when he was asked for the reasons to offer himself like that, he said, why are you doing this? He said, because I'm a Catholic priest. Now let me tell you about how he got to this position, because you see, remember the psychoanalyst who said a living faith, alive. And this, I think, is what happened here. This is a good example. 3 weeks later, he was assassinated by lethal injection. How he came to this deeply held faith and this I don't know what is it, ability, his being able to offer himself this regard and this love for others. It started like this. He was, as a young man in 1917, he was in Rome as a seminarist, and he was a student of theology there. And it was at the time, in 1917, that there were very powerful and not so much hidden anymore Freemasonry lodges that were openly displaying themselves against the Catholic Church, obviously. But there were demonstrations and everything, because at that time they were actually celebrating the 200th anniversary of the from 1717 here in England, the official, as it were, founding of the new Freemasonry. Anyway, they were so sure that the Catholic Church had been or was being destroyed at that moment. They would have to wait a few more decades, but at that time they were absolutely certain that they were being destroyed, to the point where there were demonstrations in Rome, totally anti-clerical, blasphemous, all sorts of things. And they actually went to St. Peter's Basilica, and they actually climbed many of the, well, I don't know how they did it, the walls, and put banners and posters there. They were so sure that the Vatican will be gone very, very soon. They were, as I said, celebrating 200 years of their foundation. And they were not hidden, they were out there, public and active, with pamphlets and posters and banners and distributing pamphlets everywhere. And Maximilian was actually, as a young seminarist, was actually quite deeply impacted. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that this was happening. He was a young seminarist. And he wrote in his notebooks, and what was happening. He says in his notebooks, demonstrations in the Vatican with songs in honor of Satan and Lucifer, with banners. Some of the banners read, Lucifer will reign in the Vatican and the Pope will be his slave. Yeah. But these were banners, written on banners, taking them everywhere. He couldn't believe it. And Colby wrote how they were placed with a banner under the Vatican windows. And he said, Freemasonry in Rome appeared more and more in public, displaying their banners openly under Vatican windows. Some of them representing the Archangel Saint Michael, trampled on and defeated by Lucifer. This was open like that. And they distributed pamphlets openly against the Pope. They were very active, very daring at this time out in public. And he continues writing, this mortal hatred of the Church of Christ and his vicar on earth comes from the principle of Freemasonry, the destruction of all religions, but especially of Catholicism. Throughout the whole world, the scattered cells of this mafia try in the most varied ways, more or less visibly, to achieve the same objective. Doing so using a whole horde of many associations with many different names and purposes that, under their influence, still propagate religious indifference and weaken morality. Anyway, this was 1917, but what happened was that he was so distraught by that when he went back to Poland, he founded an organization to fight Freemasonry and this kind of thing. Okay, but then events took place, and he had a large not seminary, a large monastery, I suppose, education and so on. And then what happened with the events with the war, they took in a lot of Jews. A lot of Jews were actually kept, well, not kept. They came there, to hide, and he accepted them. As a matter of fact, his name is in an official register. I don't remember the name, but it is one register, a Holocaust, that the Jewish people themselves put him up as a defender of one of those people who actually defended them. And so eventually what happened, there were so many of them that the authorities came and closed it down and took all of them, including all the priests and the monks and everybody else, to the concentration camps. So anyway, that's the story. It's a true story of Saint Maximilian Maria Kolbe. But I thought of it because of what the psychoanalyst says at the end there, that a faith that is alive will actually save you from becoming a slave. Yes, they can imprison you. Yes, they can kill you. But he was never a slave. He knew who he was and why he was doing it. Okay, I leave you there today. Thank you very much for your support. Bye-bye.